Culture is critical because, Peter Drucker already said that culture eats a strategy for lunch. Everybody knows that. But the problem is that almost nobody knows that organizational structure eats culture for lunch, because culture is an emergent property of organizational structure. So in order to change the culture, you have to first transform the dominant hierarchy. We cannot avoid talking about the culture, the toxic culture that almost every single human that has worked somewhere has experienced. And the problem is that this toxic culture is a consequence of the organizational structure. And here's where people get lost, because you hear all the time all these types of phenotypes, flat hierarchies, matrix organizations, chaotic, cellular, all different shapes and forms, but these are just fiddlings around the shapes. They do not address the core issue about the genetic makeup, the organizational structure itself, the hierarchy itself. People do not understand that hierarchy equals structure. If you don't have a hierarchy, you don't have a structure, and therefore you have a mess. So these things already were discovered way back in the 60s, when IBM was the first who realized that the bureaucratic structure, which by the way was beautifully and deliberately designed to restrict human behavior based on a dominant hierarchy, a restrictive hierarchy, because that's what was required 200 years ago, because people were dealing with mostly illiterate workers and they have no time or resources to train them or educate them. So the bureaucratic structure, this dominant hierarchy, restrictive hierarchy, and tropophobic hierarchy worked beautifully 200 years ago until just the mid-50s and 60s, when companies like IBM began to realize that they cannot handle the turbulence and the increasing relevant uncertainties that were appearing on a daily basis. And so they tried to find a solution. And unfortunately, the Big Four thought of a way to milk and market different types of solutions to this nightmare. But what they did was just create a lot of games and schemes that the only thing they do is to change the shape on the outside while living inside this restrictive and tropophobic structure. So the only alternative to fix this nightmare is to transform that restrictive and tropophobic structure into an enhansive and tropophilic one. And that's precisely what this process developed by Fred and Marilyn Emery, this Australian social scientist. Fred worked at the Tavistock Institute in London, and it's called the Search Conference and Participative Design Workshop. And through this process, you can transform any bureaucracy, any restrictive and tropophobic structure on hierarchy into an enhansive and tropophilic one. And once you do that, all the pathological implications of the bureaucratic structures, lack of engagement, lack of commitment, lack of responsibility, all those negatives by default become a positive, because human beings are always looking for a higher purpose. You can see especially with the millennials, they don't want to work just for money. They want to work for something that makes them have a higher sense of purpose, of contributing to society. So that pretty much addresses the whole thing. I hope I have addressed the whole question.